Hello and welcome to another video trying to get you the very top grades. Today we're focusing, as you know, on the role of women and femininity in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So the picture I've picked you is not really a random one. It asks us to consider how women are viewed in Stevenson's society. As you can see, this is a pretty unflattering picture. And the motion of this character is to accuse that one. And that's what's going on in Jekyll and Hyde. What we have is a really unattractive portrait of women. Now, this isn't because Stevenson is sexist. It's much more about what he feels his society is doing to women. They are marginalised, they are excluded. And that is his point. He marginalises and excludes women in this tale because that's what society does. He has another reason as well, which is that he wants to explore the problems with men, not with mankind, but with men. However, we could also argue that he might feel a sexist horror at women. We don't actually know for certain, but we can definitely say that his portrayal of women is deeply unflattering. So let's have a look at how they're described. This is the description of the maid as she watches the killing of Sir Danvers Carew. The lane, which the maid's window overlooked, was brilliantly lit by the full moon. So the moon is immediately symbolic of clarity, but also of the supernatural and then evil. It is perhaps a deliberate link to, if you like, the Macbeth witches, this idea that women are linked to evil. Their periods also follow the cycle of the moon, they're monthly, and we've got this clear link in literature between women and having too much emotion, and women as temptresses, women who love evil. It seems she was romantically given, for she sat down upon her box, which stood immediately under the window, and fell into a dream of musing. So we get a sense of satire here, where Stevenson is playing with this idea of what perfect woman should look like. She has to be romantic and dreamy, and she must think a lot. Women aren't here creatures of action, and they're certainly not interesting as individuals. But if we don't want to say that Stevenson is sexist, and I don't think I do, we could argue that he's making fun of this portrayal of the ideal Victorian woman by saying it seems she was romantically given. He's making fun of the idea that women had to be the romantic sex. And this doesn't just mean interested in getting married. It means interested in the idea of nature being wonderful, and she's just there enjoying the full moon. What a peaceful setting it is. Never, she used to say, with streaming tears when she narrated that experience. So again, women are supposed to be emotional. She has streaming tears. Now this is playing to the reader's expectations, but remember, Stevenson is also making fun of those expectations. But to do that, he's going to suggest that actually this woman is actually quite nasty. So let's have a look. When she narrated that experience, so she's going to narrate to tell the story of Sir Danvers Carew getting killed. How often does she tell that story? And how often does the story bring tears to her eyes? So Stevenson here is suggesting that part of this emotion might be faked, because she can reproduce it so often. And that, of course, links to the theme of the novel, where Jekyll, if you like, fakes one identity, the public persona, the handsome face of Dr. Jekyll, but underneath it, he reveals the evil face of Edward Hyde. And so this woman, the maid who witnesses the murder, has a similar two-faced nature. Never had she felt more at peace with all men, or thought more kindly of the world. You see how he's over-exaggerating, using hyperbole, over-exaggeration, to suggest how wonderfully feminine she is. And as she so sat, she became aware of an aged and beautiful gentleman with white hair drawing near along the lane and advancing to meet him, another and very small gentleman to whom at first she paid less attention. Now hopefully in my reading you can feel Stevenson's humour at her description of this old Member of Parliament wandering about at midnight by the river, what for we might get to later, and describing him as a beautiful gentleman. And obviously this isn't what Stevenson expects us to believe. He's making fun of the way she describes him, and furthermore he's therefore suggesting that she does this deliberately in order to make the story of this slaughter sound better. She conveniently makes him beautiful and a gentleman in order that it will sound much more horrific when he eventually gets his brains bashed out by Edward Hyde. Now, as I read the account of the killing, I want you to think how Stevenson is making fun of the maid's account. He's going to show us that she really enjoys retelling this horrific murder story and that she plays her part in it as someone who is delightfully interested in crime. And I'll tell you why he does that when we get to the end. But the moon shone on his face as he spoke, and the girl was pleased to watch it. It seemed to breathe such an innocent and old-world kindness of disposition. You can see how he's making fun of her description of this man. She's completely over the top, hyperbolic in her description of his sweetness. Presently her eye wandered to the other, and she was surprised to recognise in him a certain Mr. Hyde, who had once visited her master. So this connection undermines her perspective, because Hyde, as we know, is committed to evil acts. Well, why is he visiting her master? He himself must also be evil. And if you think how often Hyde is described as filling other people with horror, we know that her master must be quite a horrible character indeed, not to be repulsed by Mr. Hyde. So we don't fully trust her description of Sir Danvers Carew as this angelic figure, and for whom she had conceived a dislike. And then, all of a sudden, he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane, and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. So we can see how she's laying the drama on here, and then look at the contrast she introduces with the description of Sir Danvers Carew. The old gentleman took a step back, with the air of one very much surprised and a trifle hurt. So he's making fun again of how she describes him. He would have been horrified, but she describes him as being sort of mildly put out by this man who's just about to club him to death. And at that, Mr. Hyde broke out of all bounds and clubbed him to the earth. And next moment, with ape-like fury, he was trampling his victim underfoot and hailing down a storm of blows, under which the bones were audibly shattered. Now, let's just think about this. The maid is at the window, and she claims that she can hear his bones snapping in his body as Hyde beats him to a lifeless pulp. But could she hear a single word that they said? No. So again, Stevenson is making fun of her retelling of this story, and he's suggesting that she's retelling it in the most horrifying words possible. Now, what's he getting at here? Well, I think he's having a sly dig, a gentle dig, at his female readership. The women at home who will be reading true accounts or fictionalised accounts of crimes, the Victorian obsession with crime, the Victorian obsession with Gothic, heightened emotions, violence, and he's actually accusing all his readers of being a bit like this woman, just interested in watching, like a voyeur. And now the reason he's being gentle about this, of course, is he doesn't want to put his readers off. He wants them to read the book. But he's making a really subtle point. He's saying, well, he's asking his readers, look, how much different from Hyde and Jekyll are you? All right, you don't commit murder, but you love to read about it. You too put on this public face to try and portray yourself as innocent and wonderful, but actually underneath it, you're just as interested in the dirty side of life, in sin and crime and violence as everybody else. And then he rounds that off, just in case we haven't noticed. At the horror of these sights and sounds, the maid fainted. Now, we know that such a thing is highly unlikely. You don't just faint at things that are happening in the distance. You're horrified by them. But the idea of women fainting is, if you like, a stereotype of the time. And Stevenson is perhaps suggesting that this is another feigned emotion, a learnt behaviour where you portray yourself as one thing, but actually you're not horrified into fainting. You're actually delighted that you've seen such a story because you can keep retelling it as the maid described it. Well, next we're going to meet another form of women. As the cab drew up before the address, so we're now in Soho, in Stevenson's time known as a place of ill repute, as you like, full of crime and prostitutes. The fog lifted a little and showed him a dingy street, a gin palace. So this was a pub, but it served half pints of gin. Imagine how drunk people would get. And it's open during the day. A low French eating house. A shop for the retail of penny numbers and twopenny salads. So penny numbers are the penny dreadfuls, these books that are full of horrific crime stories. The very thing that Stevenson is making fun of in his readership, especially his female readers. Many ragged children huddled in the doorways, and many women of different nationalities passing out, key in hand, to have a morning glass. So he's ridiculing these women who are off out to have a glass at the gin palace in the morning. They're getting absolutely drunk out of their minds before breakfast. And the next moment the fog settled down again upon that part as brown as umber and cut him off from his blackguardly surroundings. So blackguardly means criminal, really. And what he's suggesting is that women are just as drawn to crime as men, and in fact worse, they give in to their alcoholic desires. And this contrasts dramatically with Utterson, who it is who's pulled up in this cab, because you'll remember Utterson really likes wine, and he stops himself from drinking wine because he doesn't want to give in to this sort of pleasure, although quite amusingly he drinks a spirit instead, just like the women. So this was the home of Henry Jekyll's favourite, of a man who was heir to £250,000 sterling. So these women are like Hyde, is what Stevenson is suggesting. And by extension, he's suggesting gently that his readers are also like Hyde, because his wider point is that we're all dual-natured in this way, and we're all fascinated by sin and evil. And then the final woman he wants to introduce us to is the one who looks after Hyde's flat. An ivory-faced and silvery-haired old woman opened the door. So at the minute she sounds like a work of art, as though she's carved out of ivory, and her hair is silvery, as though she's precious. But this is a deeply ironic description, because look what happens next. And she had an evil face, smoothed by hypocrisy. There's that word, hypocrite, another way of saying two-faced, another way of pointing out our dual nature. Dr. Jekyll is a hypocrite with his portrayal of the perfect, upstanding Victorian gentleman on the outside, but on the inside he releases the evil lust-filled Hyde. But her manners were excellent. Again, this is what we present on the surface. Yes, she said, this was Mr. Hyde's, but he was not at home. He had been in the night very late, but had gone away again in less than an hour. There was nothing strange in that. His habits were very irregular, and he was often absent. For instance, it was nearly 2 months since she had seen him till yesterday. Very well, then, we wish to see his room, said the lawyer, when the woman began to declare it was impossible. So here she's obstructing the police, because she is, if you like, an evil person, and also she's loyal to Hyde, who everybody thinks is disgusting, except, by the looks of it, his housekeeper. And this, by implication, suggests that she is also attracted to evil. I had better tell you who this person is, he added. This is Inspector Newcomen of Scotland Yard. A flash of odious joy appeared on the woman's face. So even though she was prepared to defend her master against these gentlemen coming in, she's now absolutely delighted. And we've got this oxymoron of odious and joy put together. So she's delighted that Edward Hyde is just about to be arrested. And the narrator sees this as disgusting in her, just as Stevenson wants us to see it as disgusting. This is the joy in crime, the voyeurism in other people's misfortune, that the readers come to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde for. So he's ridiculing his own readership here. Of course, not most of them won't appreciate that. They'll simply enjoy the tale. But when we pause, as we can, because we're lucky enough to study it at GCSE, we can see that he's mocking the very people who are enjoying the tale and saying, look, you're no better than Jekyll and Hyde yourselves. You know, I'm dramatising this story with murders in it, but you wouldn't stop far short because you're so passionate in people's evil doings yourselves, and you wouldn't try and stop them. You know, you'd let them carry on so you could still enjoy them vicariously. Just like the landlady isn't going to stop Hyde, she's only going to do so when she's forced to let the police in. Ah, said she, he's in trouble. What has he done? And that's the great cliffhanging moment. You can almost hear the drum beats, dun dun dun, and that's the very impulse that the reader has. The reader wants to know what Hyde has done. And notice how Stevenson refuses to tell us, you know, apart from this murder, he refuses to tell us all the evil things that Hyde has apparently got up to, because he doesn't want to give in to our desires to dwell on what is sinful and what is wrong. Again, he withholds that information from us in order to mock us. So hopefully you have worked out that the description of women explores the same theme of the duality of man, the great attraction to evil that Jekyll has in releasing his evil nature in the form of Hyde. And hopefully you've appreciated how Stevenson is mocking these same desires in his own readers. Now, the final thing you have to consider is, does Stevenson feel that he is above this himself, or is he simply recognizing that this is an essential part of human nature which he also shares? Well, the decision is up to you, but the way that you play with that interpretation, with those big ideas, is what is going to get you the very top grades. So, as usual, put your comments below, and if you would like any more revision to get you the top grades, why not subscribe?